Thank you, Dr. Bhatti, for that really wonderful story of your own courage, and also for honoring the really powerful legacy and memory of your brother Shahbaz. I think it's often hard in the aggregate for any of us to get a grasp of the magnitude of the issues that we're talking about at this conference, but narratives help, these individual narratives, and I think they can be powerful in terms of giving us a sense of what's going on and the experiences that people are having. So thank you. Let me turn now to our panelists, and we have a bit of a daunting task ahead of us here. We've got all of South and Southeast Asia to cover in about half an hour before audience participation. And we also, all of us, I think, work in countries that are a little less in the news and a little more unusual. So we're going to have to spend a little bit of time with each of our locations, just briefly getting you up to speed on these countries, and particularly the countries that you might not know quite as much about. We have some odd situations in our countries. We have countries that run counter to certain kinds of narratives about which religions are tolerant and which are not. So we have among our countries that are predominantly Hindu and predominantly Buddhist. And those are not the kinds of countries that people tend to think will have issues with intolerance and issues with religious freedom. Within our portfolio of countries, we also, maybe perhaps surprisingly, have the 3 largest Muslim countries by population, 4 largest if you count Bangladesh, which of course used to be East Pakistan. While the news follows the Muslim world outside of the regions that we're going to talk about, we certainly have a large proportion of the world's Muslims within the countries that we've looked at. Another thing that's somewhat different here is that in many of our contexts, Muslims are co-sufferers with Christians, and particularly Muslim minorities are co-sufferers with Christians under more repressive regimes or social actors who are intolerant. So because of this, we have to allow each of our presenters to give you just a brief overview of what's going on in the countries that they've looked at. So I'm going to provide each of them a sort of opening salvo, and then after they do that, we're going to get into a lot of back and forth and hopefully a really lively discussion. So let's start at the end of the dais with Professor Hefner. Professor Hefner has dealt with Indonesia, which is a predominantly Muslim country, but it has a broad, if not uncontested, support for the ideology of Pancasila, which is fascinating and unique. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how it comes to be that Christians have come under pressure in that context.
Thank you. Perhaps before I do so, I'll just make a few additional comments about Indonesia. Of course, it's the largest Muslim majority country in the world, about 252 million people, 10% of whom are Christian. And the Christian influence in Indonesia in terms of social, cultural, and to a lesser degree political life, but in terms of social, cultural, economic life, is even greater than that 10% figure. The Christians own many of the largest media conglomerates in Indonesia. They also are very well represented, disproportionately represented in the ranks of university graduates, and they are a major proportion, again, much larger than their numbers in the middle class. Another sign of the Christian communities, at least by comparison with some of the very distressing stories that we've heard over the last 2 days, another sign of the Christian communities' relative unusual, indeed one might say, social health historically, at least in the 20th and 21st century, I'll complicate that momentarily, is the fact that the number of Christians in Indonesia has trebled since Indonesian independence. It's trebled from about 2.5% to it's actually almost quadrupled to 10%, just under 10% today. So something rather different is going on, and one doesn't see at all the least of an exodus. But one does see, now to the persecution and the discrimination, one has seen in the last years of the authoritarian New Order regime under President Suharto, 1966 to 1998, he played much as Mubarak did, as Maris Tadros told us this morning. He played an Islamist hand as he watched an Islamic resurgence sweeping the country and reached out to not the Muslim majority, not the mainstream organizations that represent the great majority of Indonesians, but to a kind of hardline fringe. And in the transition to democracy that after his regime fell in May 1998, one has seen an outbreak of violence, primarily primarily the result of a combination of factors, and I'll end here because I think my time's up, a combination of factors, but which have to do primarily with the rise of small but extremely well-organized, uncivil society, Islamist groups, and the inability of in a rather robust democratic situation, the inability of coalition governments to effectively enforce those laws that exist with regard to religious freedom, so that Islamist groups, radical Islamist groups, militias in particular, have been able to take advantage of the situation and have targeted Christians, but even much more vigorously, as Human Rights Watch and Christian Solidarity Worldwide have pointed out in two very, very important reports. Groups that have suffered disproportionately even worse have, of course, been groups like the Ahmadis and some minority Muslim sects.
Thank you. Sarah, you dealt with Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the similarities and differences of the Christians in those two contexts. And I wonder also if you could draw out one aspect that you mentioned in your report, and that is the gendered aspect of the experiences of Christians in those contexts.
So there's a lot of differences between the Christian population in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it initially comes down to numbers. The Christian population in Afghanistan is really, really small. We don't really have accurate numbers on how many Christians there are in Afghanistan because so many are underground, and because there's no open Christianity, there's no public displays of Christianity allowed in Afghanistan, so the numbers range somewhere between as low as 500 to as high as 2,000 or 3,000. In Pakistan, we have some similar issues. Legally, according to the Pakistan government, Christians comprise about 2% of the population, but if you talk to churches, and either the Catholic Church or the largest Anglican diocese in Pakistan, known as the COP, Church of Pakistan, their internal records show that there are actually many more Christians than that. Some internal church census report that the population might be as high as 5 or 6%. We don't actually know. The population statistics in Pakistan for minorities are supposed to be determined by a census that is conducted by the government, and because of very poor infrastructure and basically bad governance, the census has not occurred in a very long time. We don't really have accurate numbers, and that, combined with the fact that a lot of religious minorities, including Muslim minorities such as Ahmadis and Shias, rely on demographic reports as well, so it's hard to get a general sense. But the basic difference is that in Afghanistan there's no public display of Christianity at all. There are no public churches, for example. Everything is underground. There are house churches, but they cannot show that they are churches in any way, which means missionizing is done in secret, if at all. In Pakistan, we don't have this issue. There are churches everywhere. Of course, there are churches that are left over from the colonial period, but there are also churches in urban slums and villages and rural areas, small congregations, house churches. We have a mixture of all kinds. Almost every Christian group is represented in Pakistan. The largest community is Catholic. Then, of course, we have Anglican Protestant communities as well, Presbyterians, but also Baptists, Methodists, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. We still have missionizing activity in Pakistan. It's not as open as it used to be, say, 20 or 30 years ago, but there are still missionaries active in the country. As far as women are concerned, sometimes women in Pakistan in general are probably the most vulnerable group in the country, and within that, minority women, so for example, Hindu women, Sikh women to a lesser extent, low caste women, and also Christian women tend to be vulnerable to a lot of things like exploitation, sexual assault, kidnapping. These are problems that happen in rural areas and in villages. They're not as common in urban centers, but there is an issue in Pakistan with Christian women being victims of kidnapping, forced conversion, and also sexual assault. And I'll end there and come back to it.
All right, thanks, Professor Singha. Professor Ponnaiah, you did research in two of these countries, Sri Lanka and India, where we have predominantly Buddhist and Hindu populations. And so it might take some explaining how it could be that minorities have ended up in trouble in those places. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how that's possible, and then just give us a very brief overview of the experiences of Christians in both India and Sri Lanka.
Okay, so can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So the Indians, in India, the Christians constitute about 2.3%, and out of that, half of Indian Christians are Catholics, then 1/4 Protestant and 1/4 evangelicals or, Pentecostals. And the Indian Christianity is characterized by two kinds of, realities. One is the Christians are seen as the vestiges of colonial rulers, So Christianity has a close association with coloniality in India, as a case also in Sri Lanka. And the second thing which is unique to India is also, though Christianity in India is as old as Christianity itself, 2,000 years old in the case of Syrian Christians, however, Christianity's growth really took place in a big way only after colonial rule. So, and that too among the local Christians, the Dalits, the untouchables. Therefore, the perception in India is Christianity is a Dalit religion. That's one of the reasons why even Christian service to the nation is looked at as what Dalits should do to the high caste. Okay, it's not acknowledged properly. That's a new dimension to it. Because of these two situations of one association with colonial period or colonialism or colonial rule, the other one is association with the Dalit Christians, Christianity is seen as suspect and disrespectful. Okay, so this is the situation in India. As regards Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan Christians were rather prominent. They had a lot of power during colonial times, and after independence, that gradually began to shrink. Because the Buddhists got into administrative structures. So their power began to erode. 2-3 developments actually went against Christians. Number one is the nationalization of Christian schools in the year 1968. And a singular language was made as official language, replaced English. So that became the second one. The third development is in 1978, the Constitution of Sri Lanka was rewritten, in which Buddhism was given a foremost place. That meant that the state has the obligation, a mandate, to promote Buddhism and to foster and to safeguard Buddhism. So that becomes a source of harassment for Christians. Okay. As regards persecution itself, there are various kinds of persecutions. You can speak of state or legal persecution. You can speak of state policies. One thing that is very clear is in both the countries, the constitution itself is not very clear. That ambiguity leads to persecution. Okay. For instance, in Sri Lanka, the Article 10 of the constitution talks about the foremost place to Buddhism, while Article 14E speaks of the right of the individuals to practice and to profess their faith either in private or in public, alone or with others. Therefore, there is a tension between these two provisions of constitution. As far as India is concerned, the constitution is very clear. Article 24 speaks about the freedom of religion, for Indians. You can profess your faith. However, many states, the provisional states, put in place what we call the Religious Freedom Act, actually anti-conversion law. Paradoxically, it's known as Religious Freedom Act, which in fact bans conversion to Christianity between any religion other than Hinduism. Okay, so there is a tension. Therefore, the central government, the federal government wanted to put in place a law governing all the states as regards conversion, banning conversion. Some of that has not come into effect. So probably. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, excellent, thank you. And thanks to everyone already for keeping us moving along. So, Professor Reimer, one of the things that you mentioned in your report that I thought was really fascinating was that the range of Christian experiences was affected by three main factors. The first was whether they were Catholic or evangelical, so a denominational sort of factor. The second was their ethnic identity, and that's a really interesting aspect of the story in Vietnam and Laos. And the third was the time that the groups had been in country, their historical, the length of time that they had existed. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that range of experiences in both Vietnam and Laos. And again, we apologize that we are summarizing multiple countries in a matter of minutes, but thanks for your patience.
I'll do my best. Whenever I get the opportunity to report on the situation of Christians in Vietnam, Laos, and so on, the Vietnamese authorities, sadly, rarely fail to provide me with a very recent example of their mistreatment of Christians. Lawyer Nguyen Van Dai is the best known evangelical human rights and religious freedom advocate in Vietnam, having just completed 4 years in prison and 4 years of house arrest. Last Sunday, December the 6th, Lawyer Dai and 3 of his colleagues were returning to Hanoi after participating in a conference on law in Nghệ An province when their car was stopped by 20 plainclothes policemen. The 4 occupants were hauled out of the car, and 3 of them were badly beaten on the spot. Lawyer Dai was thrown into the back of a windowless van and beaten and pummeled and kicked and punched and hit with clubs for the better part of an hour before his half-conscious body was dumped on a beach at Cua Lo near the city of Vinh. That was last Sunday. I certainly get the point after sitting here for these couple of days that radical Islam, for lack of a better term, has replaced communism as the main engine of persecution of Christians, but remind us that there are still 1.5 billion people in the world living under some mutant form of communism perhaps, but one thing that hasn't mutated is communism's high suspicion of religion and even hatred, especially of Christianity. My studies took me to Laos and Vietnam. My wife and I just celebrated our 49th anniversary of our arriving in Vietnam as missionaries before the Vietnam War. The 2 countries have a mere 100 million people, Vietnam, of course, being by far the largest. And about 10% of that 100 million people are Christians. The largest Christian body by far is the Roman Catholic Church in Vietnam, 7 million strong and 4 centuries old. The evangelical movement, which is just a century old, appears to be has been the main focus of communist oppression. The evangelical community since 1975, when Vietnam was united under communism, has grown by a factor of between 12 and 13, from a mere 160,000 to nearly 2 million people. And most of the growth has been among ethnic minorities, and that is where the persecution has been the worst. In closing this section, I'll just identify, I have identified, I think uniquely, one way that the communists in Vietnam have very cleverly found to outsource persecution. In the middle of the decade of the 2000s, when Vietnam wanted to join the World Trade Organization, it was pressured, particularly by the United States, to make some modifications, at least in its laws or regulations regarding religion. And at that point, it ceased government-sponsored campaigns of recantation, especially of ethnic minorities. But Vietnam discovered that there was strong social pressure also against conversion of animists to Vietnam, which the ethnic minorities are. And while it once considered the animism, the worst of religion, superstition and harmful and so on, it allied with animistic opponents of Christianity, turned a blind eye to what they did to their own fellows, and began promoting what was once superstition as good and beautiful customs, thereby outsourcing persecution of ethnic minority Christians.
Thank you. I want to go back to the other end of the table here for a question about legal restrictions. So, Dr. Bhakti, you talked about the anti-blasphemy laws in Pakistan, and of course, those aren't unique to Pakistan. So, I wonder if first Professor Hefner and then Professor Singha could talk about the legal restrictions that Christians experience in your context, and then some of their responses to those restrictions, the ways that they've tried to deal with them or find a way around them, etc.
Well, there are a number of restrictions on religion generally. Indonesia follows not a liberal model of democracy, but in as much as it has been influenced and aspires to a profession of democracy, it's primarily a consociational model, which if you know the Dutch and Belgium cases, you know what I'm speaking of. I won't go into political theory, but just to make that point, it accommodates religious representation in a way that puts much more emphasis on corporation and community than on individual rights as its point of departure. Just important to keep in mind. There are two sets of restrictions, I think, that loom large in the minds of many Christians, as well as nonconformist Muslims, like the Ahmadis, but also some Sufis in Indonesia today. The first is the so-called blasphemy law, which is probably more properly characterized as an anti-defamation law. It was put in place not by Muslims. It was a concession by the then very left-wing nationalist President Sukarno in 1965 as he was wheeling and dealing, veering far to the left in alliance with the Communist Party. But it was a concession to Nahdlatul Ulama and some mainstream Muslim organizations at a moment that they were feeling very estranged. It was not much implemented subsequently in the New Order government that arose in 1966 in the aftermath of the destruction of the Communist Party and the killing of 500,000 people. It really begins to be seriously implemented and prosecuted primarily against people within the same faith community rather than, as in some South Asian countries, across faith communities. Primarily begins to be implemented only in the late 1990s, but especially once again the democratic era of the New Order of the post-New Order regime, the post-May 1998 period. There's all sorts of sociological and political reasons for that, which I can't go into here, but they have primarily to do with an unusual alliance that arises between those groups that I referred to earlier, those uncivil society, civil society organizations that experienced a new freedom in the robustly democratic era on one hand, and on the other, one in particular semi-governmental organization, the Council of Indonesian Ulama, which was sort of established by the Indonesian government and then sort of declared its independence in the democracy era. These two forces have made a kind of unusual alliance and created circumstances in which, not entirely at a national level, but in certain hotspot provinces in particular, three in particular of the 32 that Indonesia has, this coalition has resulted in kind of heightened policing of both religious borders, but also orthodoxy within, above all, the Muslim community. Lastly, and much more quickly, I won't go into details, there have always been restrictions on the building of houses of worship in Indonesia. That goes back to, once again, the founding of the Republic in 1945 and 49. But those restrictions have been enforced with a new vigor as part of the wheeling and dealing of the more open democratic era, a downside of the open wheeling and dealing and coalitional politics that has characterized Indonesia in its new and very robust, but in some ways deeply flawed, democratic springs, again, since 1998-99.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really fascinating about this story is the fact that these anti-defamation laws have been on the books for so long and only recently are being used and applied. And we have something similar going on in both Pakistan and India with actual British colonial laws, Section 295, which is there in both Indian and Pakistani laws. Section 295, which has kind of anti-defamation prohibitions against anti-defamation, and that, for the most part, were dormant until quite recently when they've begun to be applied. So, Professor Singh, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and whatever else you'd like to say about the legal restrictions that Christians experience.
Section 295, the blasphemy law, was introduced during colonialism in British India, and ironically, it was introduced at that time to keep the peace between Hindus and Muslims. It was a way to sort of make sure that the one group didn't say anything negative about the other. In Pakistan, of course, I think the one thing that people know about Pakistan is blasphemy law, and as Dr. Bhatti said earlier, the blasphemy law is greatly abused in the country, and it is done, as he said in his speech, to a lot of times to settle scores. I think that's something that we should keep in mind, is that first of all, the blasphemy law in Pakistan has affected Christians, of course, but the people that have been probably the most affected by it and have been wrongly accused of it are actually Muslims. Primarily minority Muslim groups such as Shias and the Ahmadis have been the worst recipients. There is nobody who is really safe from accusations of the blasphemy law, and the biggest problem that we have in Pakistan is we have a problem with tribalism and we have a problem with feudalism. And both of those mentalities lead to a situation where personal scores are settled between people by using things like the blasphemy law and by having false accusations. And because the law itself is so tedious in its in the way that it's established, in the way that it works. Essentially, you don't need any witnesses. You don't need much corroboration. You just need the testimony of a good Muslim, whatever that means. Which means that there's a lot of false accusations of blasphemy, and a lot of people, as Dr. Bhatti said, Rimsha Masi was a case of this 14-year-old girl who, by all accounts, had a mental problem and was wrongly accused, and this was something that incited a national response, including from the Muslim community, as the head of the Ulama Council, Mr. Tahir Ashrafi, actually stepped in and tried to do something on Rimsha's behalf. Other cases have also created outrage. Salman Taseer, as Dr. Bhatti talked about, was the Muslim governor of Punjab, which is a very highly influential position, who was assassinated for participating with the National Minority Council and promising to repeal the blasphemy law. So in addition to that, I think another problem is political participation, which, as I mentioned earlier, political participation in Pakistan is partially determined by demography. So seats in parliament are determined by religious demography. If the census isn't conducted regularly, there's really no way to see and determine whether population is going up. And one interesting thing about Pakistan, since we have bad infrastructure and the census hasn't been conducted in a very long time, the demography for Christians and other minorities hasn't increased since partition, which is impossible. So it's been completely stagnant. So, and that determines how many seats there are, because there's a reservation system. It's a quota system depending on demography. So that means that even if people had the ability and the chance to be more politically active, they sometimes can't.
Thank you. Professor Panaya, a different question. You'll be sort of representing the whole group here in talking about intra-Christian dynamics. So in each of these contexts, there are some really interesting dynamics between Christians, among Christians, and particularly between mainstream Catholic and Protestant Christians on the one hand, and evangelicals and Pentecostals on the other hand. So I wonder if you could talk about the way that the intra-Christian dynamics in India and Sri Lanka have affected the experiences of Christians there, and also their responses to those negative experiences of repression and persecution.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks to persecution, there is a lot more unity among Christians. In the case of Sri Lanka, the Christians were kind of divided by 1970s. The historians would say on ethnic line, the Catholics especially. Catholics were divided as Sinhalese and Tamils. It's after persecution in 1995 thereabouts, a lot more unity brought about between Sinhala Catholics and Tamil Catholics. This was very clear when the chair and myself attended one of the conventions in the Madhu, Shrine Madhu, where Pope Francis had visited the place, and he made a prayer for unity among Christians in Sri Lanka. And the prayer, the convention, charismatic convention that we attended, very clearly projected, Father, make us one. So there is a felt need for the Catholic community to come together across the divide of ethnic divide. I think the religious persecution is a context in which this took place, of course, in the post-ethnic, post-war situation as well. When it comes to the relationship between the mainline churches and the evangelicals, I think persecution has helped them to form, solidarity. They have explored different ways and means of coming together. They have various fora at the state level, at the national level in India, and they have prayer meetings held together. They have interfaith meetings. So all that, help them to, all these things help them to, explore unity among them. So it has, in a way, fostered unity among Christians. The evangelicals are, so far, have been sidelined. In fact, the attacks in Sri Lanka against evangelicals is not only by the Buddhists, but also by Catholics, They also harass them in many ways. Probably now, officially, at least the official standpoint is, they don't really, belittle evangelicals in the public eyes. But I think internally there is a kind of a dissent against evangelicals, that they are actually grabbing the Christian groups, sheep stealing, as you call them. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think one of the things that was so fascinating to us was the fact that the stance of the mainstream Protestant and Catholic communities towards Pentecostals and evangelicals was very important, because if the mainstream Christians kept some distance from Pentecostals and evangelicals, by doing so they made Pentecostals and evangelicals more vulnerable to attack. But if they stood in solidarity with them and used their sort of broader Christian political power to support their evangelical and Pentecostal co-religionists, then those groups were somewhat less vulnerable to attack.